Hi, and welcome back to the Mom on Mind podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. And on this episode, I am joined by Dr. Rebecca N. Thompson. She's a family medicine and public health physician in Portland, Oregon, who specializes in women's and children's health. And she's the author of Held Together, a shared memoir of motherhood, medicine, and imperfect love. And she's on today to share a bit about her journey into motherhood and going through some complicated pregnancies and losses and learning to become a doctor herself, how that shaped her medical practice, her perspective on parenthood, and then how those experiences led her to collaborate with patients, friends, medical colleagues to share their stories about the many ways that creating and sustaining families can take unexpected turns. Our own Wendy Davis of Postpartum Support International gave a review which reads, "This book does not seem like a book. It seems like a quilt that weaves together stories to create a treasure, and reading it is a healing. The women within these pages share the impact of deep loss, fear, self doubt, and surprises, both agonizing and wondrous. As I read, I was with these women, sitting before them like the receptive and open pages of a journal, absorbing their truths. I hung on every word." What a fantastic endorsement. So let's dive in and learn a little bit more with Dr. Rebecca N. Thompson. Welcome, Rebecca. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for including me.
Yes, I'm happy to have you on to share your story and share the book, Held Together, that you wrote along with some other amazing people who are sharing their story. But first, I would love to get a sense from you of like what went on for you that even led to
Mm,
writing this book.
right. So, when I was first starting out as a new physician, I had just finished up my residency and starting out on my first job beyond that. My husband and I went through three complicated pregnancy losses, including two that were life threatening to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that in spite of all my medical training and knowledge, I just felt really lost.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I was supposed to be the expert in health and healing, but I really just felt discouraged and confused by all the ways that my body was failing me.
Right, right.
And I was hesitant to share any of this. You know, in medicine, we're supposed to be strong and just take care of our patients and soldier on. And um, I also just really didn't know anyone else who was going through these kinds of things at that time,
Mm-hmm.
or at least no one who was talking about going through
Mm-hmm.
these kinds of things.
Right, right.
Um, I felt like everyone around me was having baby showers and kids' birthday parties and asking me if I wanted to have a baby too. Um, but, once I just really tentatively started to open up a little bit about my experiences, um, I discovered I really wasn't alone at all. Many, many people I knew had been going through these things,
Mm-hmm.
and many of the women I met as my patients, friends I'd had for years, other medical colleagues, um, they started to tell me about losses they'd gone through that they'd never really talked about with other people. Or even if it wasn't about loss per se, everybody had something to say about their family's complicated origin story or
Right.
complicated relationships in their family.
Sure. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing? How much people carry and you just don't know until you start
Yes.
talking or
Yes.
everybody has some kind of a story.
Exactly. And just once you let that little bit of light in, you
Mm,
find just yourself flooded with these
mhm,
amazing, amazing stories that people have endured. And so those experiences really made me want to give back,
mm,
um, you know, from the care that I'd received during all those complications. I wanted to give back for the truly life saving care I'd received from many people during that time, and also help other people avoid the times I'd been misdiagnosed or dismissed, as happens
right.
to all of us as we go through,
Right.
especially
Too
pregnancy or
many
women's
times.
health care of any kind, too many
Mhm,
times, any kind of women's health care that ends up happening too
mhm,
often.
mhm.
Um, so I went back at that point to complete a second residency focusing on women's and children's health. And
Second
yeah,
residency. Not that many people sign up for a second residency. I don't
right.
think that's common.
Yeah, well, sure, it's definitely not, and it was a huge leap of faith
Mm,
because, um, you know, I didn't know what my outcome was going to be at that time,
Mm.
and I'd love to talk more about that, that aspect and that decision. But, I just felt like I had so many wonderful conversations with people, both in being their doctor and just in the stories that came out as I started to share my own story, that, um, I knew these stories, the individual stories were really meaningful and really healing to talk about together, but
Mm.
I had the sense this just could be the foundation for something so much more far reaching. And
Mhm.
I wanted to preserve these stories, these kinds of conversations that we were having as a way
Yeah,
to help others and help others benefit from them too.
right. And
So,
right, y- and in a way that like you had also benefited from hearing other
yeah,
people's stories.
yes.
It's really quite amazing. Like even if you never ever talk to the person whose story you've heard, but it touches you, that stays with
Mhm.
you and it can have a
Mhm.
lasting impact
Yes.
if there's even like one part of it that resonates for you.
Yeah, we really can see ourselves in each other's stories even when they don't seem anything like ours on the surface.
Hmm.
And I
Oh,
think
right.
that's also why, I realized really quickly what I was going through was about pregnancy at that time, but the stories I wanted to tell and the stories that we all need to hear, they're not just about pregnancy, birth, and adoption. They're not just about those earliest days. Those stories are important
Hmm.
because those are our origin
Hmm.
stories.
Hmm.
Origin stories are incredible. I mean, that's what's so compelling is how we became who we are, individually or as a family.
Hmm.
But I felt like Held Together is really I needed it to be about, and I wanted everyone else to read about the long arc of parenthood. So
Yeah.
how families come to exist, but also how they grow and struggle and sometimes thrive and sometimes fall apart. It's
Hmm.
it's everything in between.
Hmm.
So
So hearing these stories made you want to, like you said, preserve them,
mhm.
but like literally preserve them in the in written form.
Yes, and literally in that. So I think that's the why
Mhm.
about writing this book, but I think the how is really worth highlighting too. I think it's pretty unusual.
Mhm.
I really wanted to capture other women's stories in their own voices, but I didn't want to compile an anthology. I didn't want to just
Mhm.
say to people, go write down your story and then give it to me, and I'm going to throw it together in this book. I
Mhm.
really wanted to work collaboratively with each of these women, um, to craft the most compelling version of their story that we could together,
Mhm.
to use the medical nuance. If she had understood that, about half of the collaborators are medical professionals themselves,
Mhm.
everything from nurses and doctors, massage therapists, EMT,
Mhm.
psychologists, like a huge range of other kinds of healers.
Mhm.
And so many of them had a lot of medical insight. But even if they didn't, I really wanted to bring out the interesting kind of medical aspects of their stories and do it in a way that was really approachable
Mhm.
for readers who weren't medical professionals themselves as well. Um, so what we did was, well, each relationship, of course, with these 21 other women, each relationship was different. Some of them I've known for 20 or even 30 years as friends, or um, some were my medical colleagues, some were my patients over the years. And each of them we did have in common. We would record interviews. So if she lived nearby, we might go for a walk or meet up in a coffee shop. If she didn't, because some of them are in other countries as well, or many time zones away, we would record on the phone. But in any case, we would kind of sit together or walk together and clip on a little recorder around her neck out walking on a trail and just talk about her story.
Mhm.
And, many of these people, as I said, I'd known for literally decades. And I thought, okay, yep, I know you have this really interesting story. Let's talk about it. And every single time that happened, I was completely amazed
Mhm.
by how little of her story I actually knew before we started
Mhm.
this. The levels of detail and the implications and the repercussions that came out, I had no idea. I thought I
Mhm.
knew my friends, and I hope that I'd known them to some degree, but wow, it was a whole new level of getting to know people and how they thought about their experiences.
Did you at all find mm, Well, I guess I'm having a couple of assumptions as you talk through that,
Hmm.
that like that maybe, people weren't sure about how you were gonna hear their story or feel about
Hmm.
it, or I mean, there's a lot of reason people don't share their story, and
Yeah.
a lot of it is like shame based, or
Yes.
like
Yes.
stigma based.
Absolutely.
So do you have any sense of if like that was there, or I guess the secondary question, did you guys feel closer after?
Oh, definitely to the second question in every case.
Yeah,
And I mean, again, these are all different relationships.
yeah,
So
yeah,
some being patients, there are boundaries there, of course, and
yes.
some being friends I've known forever. I think that, you know, one thing I said to all of these women was that I hoped they could tell the most honest version of their story they could. Then we would decide what to do with it.
Hmm.
So I never had the sense that I would make them commit to, well, you said that and now I'm writing it down.
Oh,
And
right,
so,
right,
and the
right.
other factor I think that goes into this, so some of these women are amazing writers, and one of them has even written a book of her own,
Mm,
totally different genre, but a lot of them have journaled and written all sorts of things to kind of process their experience,
mhm.
and many of them gave me writings that they had. So these were
Oh,
usually more
cool.
casual writings,
Yeah.
um, often journal entries, or I might say, give them a writing prompt like, okay, we talked about these parts of your story. Could you go now and write a couple paragraphs about this experience that you had or what
Mhm,
this meant to you?
mhm.
And some of them gave me emails that they or their partner had sent to family and friends during a time of crisis,
Oh,
that they were
interesting.
updating family and friends. And I took whatever pieces they were generous enough to share with me, and I tried to weave those together. So
Mhm,
whenever possible, I would use her words, her expressions, her tone of voice. I think
mhm,
when you read this, you'll see there really are personalities. They have different voices in the stories, but there's a cohesive feel, I hope, that I tried
mhm,
to overlay of the tone of the
mhm,
stories, and
mhm.
kind of they each have a narrative arc, and you feel like you're walking through that experience with the person, but trying to really preserve each individual voice as
Mhm. That's amazing. That's amazing. So, that's really powerful too, to get some of those like in the moment. I mean, even for, I mean, if anybody's ever written anything down and then read it later,
well.
it can really, really take you back. And sometimes it's even
Yeah,
hard later. You think, oh, I'm never gonna forget this, and then you
right.
do.
You
Or
do.
like bits and pieces, fall away from you, because our
Mhm.
brains can only hold so much.
Mhm.
But that's really powerful to have those
Mhm.
bits, and
Mhm.
parts of their journey from those moments themselves.
Yeah, that was the intention, to preserve that. And, to preserve those feelings from that moment. And then also, and in all of these cases, we went back and forth over several years, I'd say on average, at least several years. I've worked on this for 10 years now, just over 10 years. And each
Mhm,
story, each chapter, we went back and forth on iterations, and we'd say, okay, we have this much. I've written what I can with what you've given me so far, transcribed all the interviews. Here's what I've got, lots of lines of, please expand on this or write about it, and give that back to her. And then she would go and flesh out some of those sections, but always we were working together, not just to fine tune the details and expand on the story, but to search for the bigger themes
mhm, mhm,
that these conversations spoke to,
mhm,
and how we might convey those.
mhm, mhm. Right. That does make it powerful. Right, because I mean, I think there are universal, like some shared experiences, even if we have these like very different aspects that show up for us
Right.
individually. And yeah, that is powerful in storytelling, is
Yeah.
when you can provide something that speaks to kind of both,
Mhm.
can speak to both.
Yeah, it's really amazing every time. And I go back and reread these. I can't even imagine how many times I've read each of these. And every time I learn something new
Mm,
about that person, but also
mhm,
about my own experiences.
mm,
And
mhm,
I think that that's what's so remarkable about these kinds of family stories is you can read something that on the surface you have really almost nothing in common with this person,
mm, mhm.
but by the time you get to the end of her story, you've learned something new about yourself.
Right. Right. That can absolutely, that can be a surprising part about
Yeah.
listening to somebody else's story. That made me
Yeah.
reflect on times I've had that experience too.
Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. And
Hmm.
I think that, that really speaks to, as clinicians, again, with about half of them being some kind of healthcare professional, I think that's part of why these stories are so compelling, that they really highlight our vulnerabilities and our
Hmm.
imperfections. And they remind us that we still have a lot to offer, even during our own struggles. So we can still help care for others, even while we're finding our own way.
Oh, right. Right. You don't have to have this perfectly wrapped up, figured
Hmm.
out,
Hmm. Right,
whatever
right,
situation before you can be support to somebody else.
right. And it's probably better if you don't. I
Hmm.
think most people don't want the people who care for them, whether that's medical professionals or just other people in their lives, they don't want perfection. They want
No.
us to be approachable
Hmm.
and sympathetic
Hmm.
to not having everything always figured out.
Sure. I mean, in a way, like let's say that was a scenario. You met this person who was perfectly all buttoned up and had everything figured out. It's hard to relate.
Hmm.
And it's hard to feel comfortable
Hmm.
sharing. It can be intimidating,
Yes,
for sure.
yes,
Like that,
exactly.
you've like really relating on a human level is very, very powerful.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. Oh, so was that a part of a theme, anyways, that you found was like the caregivers, the people who were professionals, did they, maybe not exactly the theme, but did they feel like they were like impostery, like
Yeah.
trying to help other people while they were not feeling well?
Yes, yes, that it definitely came up in many of the stories.
Hmm.
I think one of the ones that most comes to mind is early on in the book. You meet Tess. She's a child psychiatrist, and she has a really difficult time with her first child. Really, really hard to bond with her. Really, as she says, colic seems too tame a word to describe what happened to us, but
Hmm.
just a really hard to console child,
Hmm.
who she felt like, I'm a child psychiatrist and I can't even manage my own infant. How can
Hmm.
this be,
Oh,
right?
right. Yeah, 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 yeah.
And I think that's a way that it struck someone right at the beginning of parenthood, but we see this theme in many of the stories, that we feel like we should know certain things because of our profession, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I know this is something that you've talked about from your own experience, and that's
Hmm.
really resonated with me when I've
Hmm.
heard those episodes from you about, like, if I'm a trained psychologist, this is you now working in the field, I should be able to understand what's happening to me.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I think there's a really big difference between having professional expertise and experiencing something yourself.
A
They can
thousand
complement
percent.
each other, but it's
Right.
really not the same thing.
Right. Yeah. That
Yeah,
that is very true. I mean,
yeah.
there's um the when you're the in like your professional state of mind, you
Mhm.
have some distance, and some
Yes,
objectivity, and
yes,
it's not something you're like living in the like every moment of every day.
yes,
And when you're in it and you're in it, there's to your, yeah, exactly, to your point,
yes.
it is very different.
Yeah, and on the idea of imposter syndrome, it's real,
Hmm.
but I
Hmm.
also think
Hmm.
what's really interesting about how we can work against it is, I think the antidote to it is being okay with being imperfect
Right.
and letting ourselves help others even while we're finding our own way.
Hmm.
I think that the benefits of how that clinician perspective can combine with the becoming a patient perspective,
Yeah.
that's where you have the tools to say, to kind of reject imposter syndrome, acknowledge it, that we
Hmm.
all feel a little bit inadequate because no one person can do everything or be everything for another person, even in a medical relationship, right? But again, I think that clinicians, when they offer that care, even while they're struggling, it can give them a sense of agency too. It can give more purpose to what they've been through. They can, again, respecting those boundaries, but drawing on as appropriate, drawing on our own experiences in order to understand what our patients need.
Mhm.
And for the patient, for the people receiving the care, right? I think the wounded healer gives the patient permission to be imperfect too.
Right. Yeah. I think there's been a shift anyways. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
how things were done, at least medically,
Mm-hmm.
back in the day, whenever that
Mm-hmm.
was, but there was a very much like I'm the expert, I know,
Right.
and sort of like a power dynamic in a lot of
Absolutely.
ways. And we're really starting to shift away from that to a
Mm-hmm.
more like human centered
Mm-hmm.
approach. And I think that's better for everybody.
Absolutely. And this makes me think too of something that I realized during that second residency. As so I went back to do that training just as I had been kind of cleared to try again after my third loss and was about to, like, I don't know what's going to happen next, but I'll take this leap of faith to take care of all these pregnant people and families and babies. And I don't know how I'm going to go in every day and face this if I keep having complications, but
Uh-huh.
I know that if I don't try, I'll regret that. So I have to try somehow.
Mm-hmm.
But coming into it with that perspective, and especially as I got, and spoiler here, but you'll know enough about in just picking up the book that I do have two living children. And so that turned out, I did end up being
Mm-hmm.
pregnant with my son during that beginning of that residency,
Oh,
had him 9 months the day of when I agreed to start that
oh
residency.
boy.
So yeah, I like to say that the, the baby was planned, but the residency was a surprise. I kind of like decided to do it all at the last minute.
Right, right.
But especially as I started getting more experience and more confidence and really coming into my own about how I wanted to use what I learned to care for others, I found that more and more other healthcare professionals came to me for their care.
Mm-hmm.
That was a lot of who I drew on as my patient population. And um, you mentioned earlier about distance. I feel like there's this idea of helping other people, and that helping is important, but I think helping does create a distance that we can close up a bit when we think more about serving. So the
Yeah.
difference between helping and serving. And I realized that I didn't just want to help people. That kind of implies this power differential, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you're above them, you're over them somehow, telling them what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand that I want, and this became to apply to all the families I work with, not just the other medical professionals, right? That I wanted to walk beside them
Mm-hmm.
and be an advocate and a witness.
Yeah,
That's
that's
really different from being a helper,
for sure it is.
and to guide and comfort them. Right? And interesting, I think language is so powerful. Having writing a book, you won't be surprised that I believe that. But
Right.
you may notice I've said clinician when I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking about these
Mm-hmm.
kinds of encounters and these relationships. And um, I try to use that word really intentionally because I don't want to just say doctor or nurse. I want to be inclusive. I think there's, such a wide range of healing professions and medical professions that I want to include when I'm talking about this.
Yeah.
But I tend to avoid the word provider
Mm-hmm.
because to me, again, provider is like I'm trying to impose something on someone. It feels transactional or business like to me. It feels like top down.
Mm-hmm.
And like, or like we're taking orders from our patients. Like they come in and tell us what they want and then we just provide that thing. And that's not the
Oh, I see.
relationship, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I want the language to acknowledge the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And I I think clinician is the word that we can use when we're really in partnership with
Mm-hmm.
our
Yeah, I
patients.
can see that. I can feel that difference
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah. So, with that, um, I guess shift, if you will, of going from
Hmm.
helping to serving.
Mhm.
How did that shift what it felt like for you, even with writing the book?
I think that um, it it really showed me that it was doing this work together can be a practice of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about these stories, shaping them into these cohesive narratives, and many of the women told me that this was the first time in their lives, and after having gone through this experience, some of these experiences were years and years ago. Some were in the moment, but some were a long time ago. And they said that talking through this together was the first time they'd really felt like they could move past it.
Mm, that's
And
powerful.
yeah, that's how they could make sense of it. Um, I mentioned Tess, the child psychiatrist, and her story is the first one that you come to after my own. So, as I mentioned, these are kind of woven together, but each woman has her own discrete story within the book.
Hmm.
But my story begins, and then we pause after just a couple chapters, a short amount of my story, and I have a phone call with Tess, and you see what happens on that phone call, and then you read her story.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I think that's another thing that's really interesting is you see those relationships and how they change over time, and how initially, she and I couldn't connect because I was going through she'd been a friend for so many years, so many
Hmm.
years. At this point now it's more than 25 years.
Hmm.
And we just really didn't have anything to offer each other at that moment. We tried, but we just couldn't. We weren't the right people to support each other through these things because I was going through all sorts of complications and surgical recoveries, and
Hmm.
she was exhausted at the end of her perfectly healthy pregnancy and
Hmm.
needed to vent about that.
Hmm.
And we just couldn't really be there for each other.
Right.
But one thing I'll tell you that it works out. She's still one of my closest friends, but
Great.
that at that moment, that wasn't the relationship that we needed. We couldn't maintain it.
Hmm.
Luckily, we found our way back to each other, and I think maybe that's one of the lessons too. Is that this can be about how we find our way through in different seasons, and the
Hmm.
things we need and the goals we have can
Right.
change.
Right.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
that is, I mean, that is such a real thing for people to be on two
Hmm.
different reproductive kind
Exactly.
of journeys and not be able to connect
Mhm, mhm,
around that. And I'm happy for you that that didn't mean the end of your relationship. I mean, it's I think a testament to being able to work through that for you guys and I don't know, maybe the project also helped that, but um
I'm sure it did in some ways. I'm sure
mm,
it did.
yeah, I mean
Yeah.
it's so complex.
Mhm,
Like coming into even trying to be pregnant, coming into parenthood,
mhm,
being a parent, like every part of the reproductive journey is complex
mhm,
and
mhm,
pulls in so many different things about
mhm,
where you are in your life at that
mhm,
time and who
mhm,
you are and who you're turning into. It's
mhm.
it's just
Yeah,
so transformative. I mean, there's just not
yeah.
enough words.
Yeah, that's one thing that she talks about a lot in her own chapter is how her struggles with her daughter helped her to understand all the ways that motherhood can be so challenging.
Hmm.
And it really brought her this level of empathy. Even though she had trained to have empathy, it's not the same, right?
Right. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And she has this really beautiful passage I think will resonate with you. She talks about a mentor that she worked with during her training, and at the time the lessons he was trying to offer didn't really make sense to her. So he talked about, this is before she had children.
Mm.
He talked about how um, about recovery from trauma broadly, and he was referring to studies showing that the higher the quality of the survivor's narrative, the more detailed, the more nuanced her story, the less severe her suffering was as she tried to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
And to her, she says, at that point, she said his words seemed abstract enough to be nearly useless. Like, what does that even mean? Yeah. And
Uh-huh.
then she had her daughter, and she saw that every time she went back to try to tell the story, she healed a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And it really gave her this, it made it harder to feel the immediacy of the story, because she would process it and put it aside and say, okay, now I understand it at this new level.
Mm-hmm.
But it really allowed her to move past it. And she says, I love this line in that chapter, telling our stories might save us all.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's
And
really
that's what her
powerful.
story means to me. Yeah.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. For
Yeah.
sure. I mean, there's maybe there's been some, like, brain imaging study on how telling your story impacts you,
There
or
must
something
be.
like that.
There must be, right?
Something, but you don't necessarily even need a study to
Right.
know that that's true, because that's
Right.
been happening for forever.
Right.
Is like
Right.
sharing story, hearing story, all of that is
Hmm.
is a healing for the person themselves, but communally as well.
Absolutely.
That's felt at a very, I mean, there's,
Hmm.
you know, what what are, well, nonfiction books anyways, but even fiction books, or
Hmm.
a lot of podcasts, or it's like
Hmm.
people sharing
Hmm.
stories. And I think more and more people are seeking it out,
Hmm.
to hear
Hmm.
that, to get that reflection, and to
Yeah.
get their own healing or perspective, or whatever it is that
Hmm.
brings to them.
Yeah. And I think the more we can share our stories in that, with that approach,
Mm.
the more accessible they can be. So you mentioned whether it's fiction, nonfiction, like it's a blurry line. It doesn't matter. And I
Yeah,
will say all of these stories are completely, completely true.
right.
And yet I like to say not every detail will be accurate,
Hmm.
right? If I say in the introduction, if she says she was wearing a gray sweater, I believe her. I don't need her to bring me the sweater or prove it or have someone else do a fact check.
Right.
This is her story and it's
Hmm.
worthy of belief. And yet, I tried to write all of these narratives, tried to integrate all of the pieces to make them feel like fiction. They're
Hmm.
true, but I hope that they read like fiction. They just
Right.
carry you along as if you're walking beside this person
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
just listening to your friend tell you her story and being supported in your own story too along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, right, that it's helpful to keep people engaged, for sure. Not that they wouldn't be otherwise, but it sounds like you put so much thought into this.
That's the fun of it.
Mm.
That's where the stories really come alive, is in those places where they intersect, and the places where you can't make these things up. I mean, the truth is far more compelling than any fiction.
Right. Absolutely, it is. If you could kind of like maybe briefly, what are some of the overall themes? And we've talked about some of them certainly,
Mhm.
but just to name some of them.
Yeah, I think that the biggest message I came away with is that hearing people's stories and even being part of their stories sometimes is the biggest privilege that we have as
Mm,
clinicians, right?
mm,
Um, Clinicians are just people too, and the more we can acknowledge our own vulnerabilities,
mm,
the more we can find satisfaction in our work,
mhm.
and the more we can give sensitive and more effective care to our patients.
Yeah.
But none of this is just about clinicians or medical relationships, right? Any person can create that kind of space for others to share their stories just by
Right.
being open and being a listener, just choosing to listen, right?
Hmm.
Um, Life can feel pretty isolating and overwhelming these days.
For sure. Yep.
And so, since no one person can be everything to anyone and no one person can do everything, I hope that held together and that hearing our stories empowers all of us to do the something that we can do.
Hmm. Right.
Right.
Right. Absolutely. And there are so many different ways for that to happen. It doesn't have to always be some grand gesture or big
Right.
project or whatever. It can be just, small quiet moments with somebody that you care about.
Maybe that's the biggest message of all of this book is that the small moments are the important part. The
Mm.
details are where we live our lives.
Oh, yeah, that is true.
Yeah. Yeah. And just being curious about other people's stories and just being genuinely interested in each other.
Hmm.
I think that's how we build strong relationships, right? And these individual relationships are the foundation of strong communities.
Hmm.
And telling stories is just how we make meaning out of our experiences together.
Absolutely. I mean, that made me reflect on just the moment you were talking about, going on this walk and talking through the story and then feeling
Yeah.
more connected later.
Yeah.
That's really a huge part of the connection. If you're not talking about your story to somebody, and sharing it with at least one person that you feel safe enough with,
Yeah.
even if it's just parts of it, the more isolated you can feel.
And if you're not ready for that, maybe try writing it down or something even easier. I'm,
Mhm.
I'm not really someone who tells others to journal. I think if you like to journal, you've already found that as a resource for yourself. But if you don't, yeah, don't force it. I think a really helpful thing you can do is even if there's no one you want to go out on that metaphorical walk with or sit in that coffee shop with, bring yourself.
Mhm.
Bring a recorder, your phone, whatever you have to capture that, and just walk and talk as if you're telling your story to someone else.
Mhm.
Maybe you won't do anything with it. Maybe you'll transcribe it and find somewhere that you can share it. Maybe it'll just help you think things through.
Mhm.
But I think telling ourselves the stories is a really important part of healing too, shaping those narratives.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much power in it. It's the process of talking through things, I find, really slows down the thinking process enough so that you can get to some
Hmm.
of that nuance
Yeah.
um and if you've ever like talked yourself through something,
Yeah.
sometimes you're like, whoa, yeah, like you might not have even expected to hear that from yourself.
Mhm. Yeah, it helps you step back a little bit and get some perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm very excited for people to find held together and read through those stories and find some of this healing for themselves. I really thank you for doing this project and coming on here to share it with us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for this conversation. And thank you so much for all the work you do to support families with such kindness and compassion.
Thank you so much. It was a
Thank
pleasure
you.
to have you on.
Thank you.
You can connect with Rebecca at RebeccaNThompson.com, where you can find the book, link to her socials, and a bunch of other great stuff. And please do share this episode far and wide. You can also connect with me on my social media pages, Instagram. Please do share this episode with anyone who you think could benefit from hearing this story and also benefit from the book that Dr. Thompson wrote. And if you haven't yet joined me on GoTube, go do that. You can find me at Mom in Mind and you can listen in, you can watch. There's so many ways to consume this podcast, and I'm so glad that you're here doing that. Thank you so much for being with me. Until next time.